This way the online people could get a little extra credit too. Because this is not the first official word for attendance, but the first extra credit word for attendance then I guess will be online. So for those of you who are here, actually it doesn't matter. You can send it if you want to, but for those of you online, that first word is not mandatory, but you will get a slight bit of extra credit for sending in the word online as your first word. Speaking of which, sometimes I do get in a rush. So if you send those words in and then 2 days later from now I send you a reply that says full credit, feel free to reply back and say, what about the extra credit? You don't feel like you can't remind me of these things. Anyway, let's see. What do we have here? Abigail, Kincaid, Andrea, Mullins? No. Lewis is here, right? Yep. Cooper? No. Hunter is here. Caleb's here. Crowder is here. The wrong gear. Taking points away. That's all right. It's all right to write non-ranked teams. It's good. It's good to show your support. Reinhardt. The other Melton's not here yet. Julia, not yet. Rogers, Talbert. Kennedy's here, right? Yep. Kennedy is here. Hannah. Larissa is here. Madeline is here. Hughes is not here. Galloway is not here. Cook is here in red. Morgan is online. Tate is online. Burton is online. Kinder. No Kinder yet. Jones. Canterbury. Tristan. Hobson. Ray. Fisher is online. I see Cooper is online. Anybody I didn't call yet? Still have a minute, some change left. I'm gonna do my announcements in the middle of the lecture. I set myself an alarm for 8:25. Since people have a very consistent habit of coming in late, seeing as how a lot of people seem to be missing the announcements based on, well, a lot of things. We'll do the announcements in the middle. Good morning. Reinhardt, right? Why do I always do that? I know why. It's because Reinhardt sits over there. It's a side of the room thing. Canterbury is here. Good morning. Galloway, right? Yeah. All right. Galloway is here in person. All right. Well, it's 8. So really quickly, one more time, I'm going to run through the list and repeat myself just to get it on recording again, and maybe somebody else will show up before 8:01. Abigail. Oh, it's here. See? I did miss somebody. I'm glad I'm going through this again. Kincaid. Oh, yeah, sorry. Kincaid is also here. So Abigail is here. Kincaid is here. Andrea. Mullins is not here. Lewis is here. Cooper is online. Hunter is here. Melton is here. Caleb Melton is here. Crowder is here. Reinhardt is not here. Elizabeth Melton is not, or excuse me, Isabel Melton is not here. Julia, not here. Rogers. Talbert. Kennedy is here. Hannah is here. Larissa is here. Madeline is here. Hughes is online. Galloway is here. Cook is here in red. Durgan is online. Tate is online. Tasha is online. Kinder is here. Jones. Okay, thanks. Canterbury is online. Tristan Hobson is here. Ray Fisher is online. And Julia just came in. All right, let's get started. Like I said, it really seems like people are missing my announcements, both the ones that I'm doing verbally and in writing. So I'm not doing announcements today until about midway through the lecture to make sure everybody's here. Once I get Julia accounted for, then we're good to go. All right, we are good to go. So yes, once I do the announcements, then we'll talk about the exam. I'm sure there might be questions about that. But for now, let's just jump into the next chapter. So we're done with chapter 3, which was all about, remember, I mean, there's a lot of some important stuff. Mostly it's about how cells work, right? In general, the different parts of cells and stuff like that. And I said most of it you don't need to know, because some of it you will come back. Like when we talked about chloroplast and mitochondria, and nuclei, and chromosomes, stuff like that will be important later. But for then, it wasn't important. This chapter, we're finally jumping into the most, when it comes to the exam, the more important information. So now we're really going to start talking about how energy transformations work. Because remember, I told you, this next exam is basically all about energy. With some few exceptions, it's mostly about energy. Why do cells need energy? How do cells get energy? All that stuff. And that's what we're really starting to jump into it with this chapter. So here we go. And also, by the way, this chapter used to be 2 separate chapters in the last exam, or your old textbook. This used to be a chapter about how energy works, and then it was a chapter on how respiration works. But this new textbook combines it all together. So here we are. I'm still trying to get used to it. As you can imagine, since it's combined all together, it's a pretty long chapter. The first thing we're going to talk about is energy and metabolism before we jump into the rest of this stuff. The learning objectives of this section are, you should be able to explain what metabolic pathways are in general. I'm going to give you some 2 basic ones, and you'll need to know that. You need to understand, state the first and second laws of thermodynamics. You will need to know those. It's not very difficult. You've probably heard them your whole life. You maybe have even heard which one is which, but we'll get to that. You need to be able to explain the difference between kinetic and potential energy. That one's very important, especially when we talk about potential energy, because that's basically what we'll be mostly talking about in this chapter and throughout the semester, really. You should be able to describe endogenic and exogenic reactions. To me, that's a little bit less important as far as the exam is concerned. It's good to know, but at the 100 level course, for this 100 level course, I feel like if you were to forget everything, most of the things I teach you in that bullet point, then you should be fine. And then finally, you should be able to discuss how enzymes function as molecular catalysts. Now, let's see. The first word for attendance, I'm going to underline it. There it is. Well, I'll just say it since I accidentally underlined a bunch. The first word for attendance is laws. Right there, laws. First word for attendance. So let's jump into it now that we know the learning objectives. Or are there any questions about the learning objectives? All right. Here's a word that you don't need to know that was in your textbook, so I included it so you can follow along. But bioenergetics. It describes the concepts of energy flow through living systems. Now, don't get me wrong, you definitely need to understand, hopefully you're going to know this a lot better, the energy flow between systems. Like I said, that's mostly what the second exam is about. How does energy flow through systems? How is it converted from one thing to the other? So it's an important concept, but I couldn't care less that you know that it's called bioenergetics. I rarely even hear people say that. And I work with, PhD biologists. But anyway, The flow of energy is through a series of chemical reactions. There's no need to write that down either. There will be some chemical reactions you need to know. I'm going to give them some names. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. And all chemical reactions that take place inside of cells are known as metabolism. So there's a word you do need to know. Maybe because I'll ask it on the exam, but definitely because I'll use that word a lot. Metabolism. Metabolism is all chemical reactions that take place inside of a cell. And really, we're about to talk about a lot of chemical reactions that take place in the cell. But now you know what metabolism is. And that can be a little bit tricky because I think outside of biology, when people think of metabolism, they think of, your body burning fuel, right? You eat food, you burn the calories, you use them, you store the rest. That's what most people think of metabolism. And that does fall under this category because all that stuff, those are chemical reactions that take place. Any questions about this slide? All right, with this picture too, this is just a great example of that is bioenergetics, right? We talk about how energy originates from the sun in the form of light energy and heat energy, and how producers use that energy to produce stuff and consumers eat it, and then consumers die and they get decomposed, and producers die and they get decomposed, all that stuff. So there's no need to study that chart. That's just a good introduction to what we're about to talk about. But yeah, so there's nothing on this slide to study for the exam. You just need to know what metabolism is. All right, metabolic pathways. I put in a question mark next to this. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you to know the difference here, but just in case, really quickly, there's two different types of metabolic pathways, anabolic and catabolic. Anabolic requires energy because you're building something, basically. Anabolic is building something. As you should know from the last from the last exam, when you bring something together, that's a dehydration reaction, right? So as far as we're concerned, anabolic reactions, dehydration reactions. The opposite of that is catabolic. Catabolic reactions, you're breaking molecules down. You're not building them, you're breaking them down. And in the process, you don't need energy to do that, as far as we're concerned, because whatever energy was used to make that molecule that you're breaking down, it is released in catabolic reactions. So remember, anabolic is building something, catabolic is breaking something down. And if you can remember that, then hopefully you can remember the other part that you need to remember, because it's kind of intuitive. Anabolic requires energy, an input of energy, because you're building something. And catabolic does not require an input of energy, because it's breaking down. Like right now in Target, that Target in Barboursville, no one's inputting energy to break that thing down. That building is going through a catabolic reaction, so to speak, right? It's breaking down, and no one's putting in energy. Now, it took a lot more energy to build that thing, but to let it just naturally fall down the hill, it does not require an input of energy. And the most important thing, as far as we're concerned in this discussion anyway, is that both of these type of reactions require enzymes. So we're going to talk a lot about enzymes. So again, of all the chemical reactions that are happening in your body, as far as we're concerned, they're all subcategorized as two types, anabolic or catabolic. Let's see, what's another way you can remember that? So how many of you guys know that cats are an invasive species? If you're in my 108 class, you definitely know that, because I talk a lot about it. Yeah, cats are an invasive species. So that's the way I always remembered catabolic as something to break something down, because when you let a cat outside, it helps break down the local ecosystem. So that's how I always remembered it. Hopefully you can too. Now your little indoor cats, they're not breaking down any ecosystems, but I don't know, they might break stuff on your shelves or whatever they like to do. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, another word, I'm not sure you need to know it necessarily. You need to know the two different laws of thermodynamics, but this is more of an introduction. What are thermodynamics? That is the study of energy and energy transfer involved in physical matter. So all these chemical reactions is what we're talking about, right? Thermodynamics is like saying, all right, we're looking at chemistry. We're looking at changing these reactants to these products, but we're really focused on the energy of it, right? How much energy is required to change these reactants to these products? How much energy is released when we change these reactants to products? How much energy would be required to reverse that chemical reaction, right? So it's basically chemistry. As far as we're concerned, it's basically chemistry, except we're really focused on the energy portion, right? Because I know some of you have had chemistry. I've already asked you that, and you've had to balance equations. If you start with this many molecules of this, and how many molecules of that do you get? But that's not what we're dealing with here, right? It's all about the energy. And what is energy? Now, that's a word you definitely need to know for the exam. The ability to do work or to create some kind of change. the ability to do work or create some kind of change. So some examples, we have the electrical energy, right, from John Amos plant. We have electric energy coming from there. It allows me to charge my drill and put that battery in my drill and pull the trigger, and that turns something, right? That is doing work. That's the ability to do work or create change. It changed the movement of my drill. Actually, let me put an X to this before I start talking about it. I'm not necessarily going to ask you the different examples, the different forms of energy, but there you go. We've already talked about electrical heat energy. Again, going back to John Amos, we wouldn't have the electrical energy without heat energy, right? We burn coal, and when you burn coal, that releases heat energy, right? That is a type of energy. Light energy. Again, same example. When you burn coal, not that it's used in the coal plant, but when you burn coal, there is light energy released, right? The flames, that's light energy. Not put to use in that particular instance, but it's there. Chemical energy, well, again, using the same example, that coal is chemical energy. There's covalent bonds holding those molecules together, and however much energy it took to create those covalent bonds in that coal, that's how much will be released when you burn it. So that's when we convert chemical energy to heat and light energy. And of course, then that heat energy is then turned to electrical energy. But anyway, like this last bullet point says, the important ones from that list we will discuss. I mean, they're all important, but when I say important, I mean important to this course and important to your second exam. Any questions about this slide? All right. All right. Like I said, thermodynamics, you don't necessarily need to know the definition of thermodynamics, but you do need to know the two different types. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy can be transferred from one form to another, but it cannot be created or destroyed. You definitely need to know that. Energy cannot be transferred from one form to another, or it can be, but it cannot be destroyed or created. Energy cannot be created or destroyed is the most important part there. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. So when we burn coal at John Amos to convert it to electricity, most of it is converted, but some of it disappears. And I use quotation marks because it doesn't actually disappear. It goes out to the universe because it's not, energy isn't created or destroyed, right? It's just transferred. And the reason that's important to a biology class and not a physics class is because life depends on the conversion of energy from one form to another. And we said that in chapter 1, right? It's an important concept. Without it, we wouldn't be alive. And again, using the sun as a great example, you know, that picture on the right, that sun energy going to chemical energy, like that's what plants do, right? But even plants still have to convert solar energy to chemical energy. And then, of course, we can't even do that. So we have to eat either the plants that have done that or animals that have eaten those plants. Yet another conversion of energy. Which brings us to our second law, which is that energy is lost as it transfers from one form to another. So again, the first law, energy can't be created or destroyed, right? We can only transfer it. And on that note, second law, when you make that transfer, it's never perfect. You always lose some energy. Now, when I say lost, again, not created or destroyed. When I say it's lost, I mean it's lost from the system, and that's a word that I'll kind of talk about later. But again, if we're talking about John Amos as another example, yes, you're burning coal and you're creating heat and making steam and making electricity from that steam, but some of that heat is actually lost to the environment, right? So it heats the area up around John Amos. Just again, using that as an example, because some energy is lost as heat. Excuse me. Some energy is lost. Yes, it is usually as heat, but we'll talk about that later. So any questions about the first or second laws of thermodynamics? All right, my suggestion, and you can study how you want, but my suggestion is to make sure you know these laws. That's more important. And then memorize which one's the first one and which one's the second one. Because in my opinion, knowing which one's the first and which one's the second is a little bit less important. That's more of a nomenclature thing. But it is important to understand those concepts. The energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred. And when it is transferred, we always are, not always, but well, as far as we're concerned, yeah, we always lose it as heat. I mean, you lose some energy. I keep saying heat. I'm jumping ahead of myself because, yes, when we transfer energy from one form to the other, we do lose energy in that process, and it's almost always as heat. I've mentioned this before, but now I'm officially teaching it to you. What is heat? You need to know this. Heat is a type of kinetic energy, which is the random motion of matter. Well, really, you could just focus on, if we're talking about kinetic energy, just think about motion. That word in itself is good. And might as well, since I've underlined it, have that be the next word for attendance, motion. Anyway, yeah, so we're talking about heat, we're talking about kinetic energy, motion. In this case, the motion of matter, right? So the heat of the temperature of the air, right? We're talking about the movement of the air molecules. We're talking about the temperature of your bath water. That's the movement of your water molecules, even though you can't see them individually moving. It is the most chaotic and disordered form of energy. I'm not going to ask you that. That would be important for a physics class or a higher level chemistry class, but for this class, it doesn't matter, but your book included it, so did I. And again, like I was saying in that last slide, I kept saying it on accident, all energy conversions generate some heat. So when we go from one form of energy to the other, we lose some as heat. Some of them are really efficient, but some of them are less. Like, for example, my computer sometimes gets a little bit warm when I'm using it, when I'm converting it from electric energy to light energy and different things like that. Sometimes it gets really hot because, again, we're losing it as energy. Losing energy is heat, excuse me. Another term, here's a big one, put a big old X to this. This is a really important concept for people doing higher level chemistry and even higher level biology. So like I said earlier, when we're talking about thermodynamics and talking about how chemical reactions, and we're focused on the energy of chemical reactions, right? How much energy is required to start it? How much energy is released? Those kinds of things. That's what we're measuring, right? Well, what I didn't tell you was there's actually chemical equations, and they're in your textbook. You don't need to know them. But we have chemical equations that account for all this stuff. Heat, energy, and entropy. And it's all balanced, just the same way you used to balance equations with, this many molecules on this side, this many molecules on this side. Well, we do the same thing here. All the energy has to be accounted for. There's even different types of energy, free energy and stuff like that I won't get into. Point is, if you're doing that and you're using an actual mathematical formula where every single digit is important, then you need entropy, because entropy helps us with our math. Basically, that's the best way to put it. But we, in this course, don't need that. We don't do those chemical reactions. We don't worry about that stuff. So therefore, this is an unimportant concept, but your book included it, so did I. So let's really quickly talk about it. What is entropy? If anything, you just need to know that is a measure of disorder or randomness in the system. So even though we can't look at this and put numbers to it, I can tell you that there is less entropy in this than there is in this. This has more entropy than this does. Just by looking at it, I can tell there's more order to the thing on the left than there is to the right. Another way of thinking about this, since we just talked about it in lab this week, is, as things diffuse, for example, you go from more entropy to less entropy, because what you're doing is going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So that would be, you're going from less disorder and randomness to more disorder and randomness, generally speaking. Not that you need to know that. That was just an example. Anyway, another reason this would be important if we were actually doing these kind of chemical equations. Every time energy is converted from one form to another, entropy increases. And that's a really long discussion I wish your book wouldn't even talk about. We could have probably a whole week of just diving into that concept. Of course, you'd have to know a lot of previous knowledge to fully dive into that concept. But anyway, the most important thing on this side, as far as we're concerned in this course, is heat. Heat is a type of kinetic energy. It's the random motion of matter. Any questions about this slide? All right. So I should point out now that I'm still teaching out of the textbook, but I've swapped the order. I don't like the way you order the way your textbook ordered it, so I'm doing this in a slightly different order. But here we go. Kinetic energy, like I said earlier in that last slide, is the energy of motion. You need to know that kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Potential energy is stored energy. That's even more important, because we'll talk about kinetic energy a little bit. Most of the energy we're going to talk about in this portion of the semester is potential energy. Where does it get its potential energy? Well, it's due to its location or its structure. And I think most people are familiar with the location thing because that's how people, like most high school teachers and middle school teachers, teach it. Like, for example, let's assume these two are exactly the same. They pretty much almost are. Which one of these has more potential energy, A or B? A, right? And why is that? Location, right? It's higher. So when I drop them, when they hit the ground, this one's going to have more force than this one, just because it has more time to accelerate. This one has more potential energy than this one. That's what we've all learned. It's correct. But for the purposes of this course, that's almost useless. Most of the potential energy we discuss has nothing to do with its location, but it's all about the structure. And we'll talk about the structure. And then these pictures are from your exam, and I like it. So here we have, there's a lot of potential energy built behind that dam, right? Because of its structure and maybe location. I guess you could argue either one of those words for that instance. But that's a lot of energy, right? That dam is holding back. That's a lot of weight on it, ready to go, right? And then when you open up the dam, that energy is released, right? Then that potential energy becomes kinetic energy as the water rushes out. Meanwhile, here we just have straight up kinetic energy, right? That water is just flowing down. That's kinetic energy. Any questions about this slide? All right, so again, you definitely need to know the difference between kinetic and potential energy. And remember, we're going to focus on potential energy, especially location. Excuse me, whoops, not location, especially structure. And we got to tell you what that means once we get there. But are there any questions about this slide? All right, it's 8:22. It's just 3 minutes before the middle of the class lecture. So let's go ahead and do the announcements now. So yes, guys, please pay attention to announcements. It's funny because I'm giving an announcement. I have a feeling some of you aren't because of the mistakes that are being made. But listen to what I say verbally. If you can't come to class, then watch the videos and listen to what I say verbally. Or get in touch with a classmate and say, hey, what did I miss? And find out what I said verbally. And also make sure you read your emails. And make sure you read the announcements, right? The announcements are on there because there's been some questions and things that have been missed that I've announced a lot. So I'm going to announce them again. First of all, the exam. 4 people still haven't taken the exam. It's due at 9. I don't understand. I said it verbally many times. The exam is due today at 9. You have a week to do it. You have a week to do the exam. Do the exam. Let me know if you need help. I've said it a lot. It's due at 9. I've also typed it a lot. Put it out on announcements. I mentioned it in lab. I put it out on Facebook for those of you on Facebook, right? A lot of reminders, yet some people haven't taken it. The good news is it's the first exam, so I expect these kind of mistakes. So I extended the deadline. It's now due at 10 today. So you have, and it's, you only have 50 minutes to take it. So you can leave this class if you haven't taken it yet and still have time to take it. The other good news about the exam, despite the fact that largely the grades were great, I'm going to let everyone retake the exam. So after the last person who's taken their first attempt, you're all allowed to retake it as many times as you want. The retake will not be timed, and the retake will be open book. Take all the time in the world you need, look up your answers, and you can retake it as many times as you want. And then once you're finally satisfied with your grade, email me and say, hey, I'm done retaking the exam. Can you adjust my grade? And what I'll do is I'll take an average of your first grade and your last grade. That make sense? All right. So sadly, despite me announcing this, one of those 4 people who hasn't taken the exam yet probably won't get the message, and they won't take the exam, and they'll have a 0. But this offer still stands for them. So even though they have a 0 at first, they can still retake the exam and potentially get a 100, and then an average of 100 and a 50. 0 and 100 is still a 50. So that person is still okay. Any questions about the exams? All right. And again, I will post reminders. And then lab, like I said, I know I'm getting picky, but this is all for a reason, and I can explain it later if you want. But you have to be on time. You have to do the pre-labs. You have to do the videos before the pre-labs if they're included. It's important. If you don't know what you're doing, 1, it's slightly dangerous. 2, like I keep saying, if you don't know what you're doing when you come in the lab, you're just going to be so focused on the details that you miss the big picture, in which case, there's my alarm to give the announcements, in which case you're just wasting your time and everyone else's time. So be on time. Make sure you do the pre-labs before you come in. If you don't, if you don't do the pre-labs, or if you're not on time, then you can't come to lab. And if this has already happened to you, I'll remind you, get in touch with me because the semester's still early. I don't want to say you get a 0. We'll figure out some extra hoops you can jump through to get some points. But anyway, contact me on that. So that's it. I think those are all my only announcements. That, and you should have what? 40 points of independent work by Sunday. I think that's it. So any other questions about how things go? Yes, good.
So you see the grades have been sent before we look at.
Yes. The question is, will you see your grades? Yes. And once it closes at 10, you should have your grades should be visible. But that's another good thing I didn't point out. What it won't tell you is the correct answers. So once it's closed, you'll know which ones you got correct and which ones you got incorrect, but it won't give you the answer. Great question. And yes, you should have your grade. And if it doesn't give you your grade, because glitches happen. If that doesn't work, if you go sometime after 10 and look for your grade and don't see it, contact me. Because 1, I'll give you your grade, and 2, I'll try to fix it so no one else has to deal with that and they can see their grade. Great question. Any other questions? All right, then back to this. Announcements are done. This is a picture not from this textbook, from your old textbook. It's a pretty good demonstration of potential and kinetic energy and how it's related. So that person right there, at least in this system, in this picture, in this situation that's happening, they have the greatest potential energy right there, right? And then they jump off. When they jump off, that potential energy is being converted to kinetic energy. And it's more and more, right? As the farther they go down, the faster they're going. So they're getting less kinetic energy and less potential energy and more kinetic energy. And then finally they hit this point, which is presumably is lowest they're going to go in this situation. They're just going to float on top of the surface of the water, right? So now they have the least amount of potential energy that they're going to have in this cycle. And then as they climb up, right, they're using kinetic energy to get up there. That's kinetic energy. And they're converting it. The higher and higher they get, the more potential energy they get. So pretty simple. You guys are all probably very familiar with this concept. But does anybody have any questions about that? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can see this little animation. This is also a nice little metaphor. We talk about the potential energy of pulling that thing back, right? And as you're holding it back, it has a lot of potential energy. And then when you let that go, that releases the energy, right, in the form of kinetic energy because the arrow moves. But this is actually a metaphor we're going to come back to a lot, believe it or not. Anyway, keep on moving. So again, like I said, between kinetic energy and potential energy is the one we're more concerned with in this course. And now I'm going to give you yet another subcategory. Under the subcategory of potential energy is a type of energy called chemical energy. So when we're talking about potential energy, potential energy is all about the location or the structure. And I said we're more concerned about the structure. But here we are. We're finally back to it. Chemical energy is all about that structure. It's all about the way the molecules are built, the arrangement of the atoms. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again a lot in this chapter. When we're talking about chemical energy, as far as we're concerned in this class, however much energy it takes to build a molecule is how much energy is ready to be released when you break that molecule down. So this is why you'll hear me use a term like, oh, this is a high energy molecule or a low energy molecule, because some of them do have more energy than others. And we already talked about that in chapter 3 when we talked about lipids, right? We talked about those long fatty acids and how much energy they have. And why do they have a lot of energy? Because it took a lot of energy to build them. So here's some other concepts. It's not exactly true, but it'll work for this course. I mentioned this before too. What's on the outside of an atom? What's orbiting? Because there's 3 parts of an atom. There's 2 parts on the inside, 1 part is on the outside. What's on the outside of an atom? Yes. Electrons, right? And what charge do electrons have? Negative. So electrons are repelled from each other because they're both negative. So this isn't 100% accurate, but I think this is a great way to think about it and it'll work for this course. Imagine trying to push 2 molecules together. They're going to want to repel each other, right? And again, that's not 100% true, but if you visualize that, that'll work for everything I'm going to teach you. Just imagine 2 things not wanting to be together, in this case, because those electrons are repelling each other, and having to squish those together. Well, however much energy it took to squish those together, that's how much energy will be released once you break that molecule. And there's other stuff we don't even get into a lot, but we will a little bit. There's other reasons that'll make things harder to squish together. It's not just about the electrons, but there are other reasons that would make some molecules harder to squish together than, some atoms harder to squish together than others. And again, the more energy it takes to build them, the more energy is released when you break them, which is why I use this metaphor, right? That's the crossbow. You're probably at least slightly familiar with it. You have to pull that thing back, right? You have to put energy into it. And once it's clicked, that energy didn't disappear, as we know from the third law of thermodynamics. It's just stored there. That energy that you put into there is stored there. And the harder it is to pull it back, the more energy is going to be released when you pull the trigger. So that energy is just sitting there ready for you to pull the trigger. And once you do, boom, energy is released. Same with a molecule, right? It took energy to put those atoms together. However much energy it took to put those together, that's how much is going to be released when you break them. Very important concept. I am oversimplifying it a little bit, but because, chemical reaction is actually a little bit more complicated than that. But as far as we're concerned, that's a great way to think about it. Nice and simple, straightforward. Any questions so far about what chemical energy is? We're going to talk a little bit more about this. All right. Again, there's that picture from chapter 3 that I was telling you about. I brought it back, and that's from your old textbook, not this textbook, but I brought it back because that's when we were talking about it, right? So cells and engines use the same basic principles to make chemical energy stored in fuels available for work, and that's exactly how we talked about it back in chapter 3 when I first showed you this picture, right? All this energy is in this octane molecule, right? There's a lot of energy to build it, and now it's just sitting there ready to go. And once you break it, like a gasoline engine does by igniting it in the form presence of oxygen, then that breaks it and it releases energy. That energy is used to move your vehicle. And then similarly, we have this food here, right? We got all those, took a lot of energy to build those molecules. When you eat those molecules and break them down in the presence of oxygen, that energy is released. Let's see. Yeah, and that's basically what it says. Another thing that you keep in mind, maybe it's slightly important, is generally speaking, when we're talking about this, we're going from a large fuel molecule and we're breaking it down into smaller waste molecules. And usually those waste molecules, as you might imagine, have less energy than the original fuel molecules. Any questions about this slide before we talk about it a little bit more? All right. Again, this is the picture. I think this is from chapter 3. Excuse me, chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the old exam. But yeah, here's just what I said, but now it's in pictures, right? You break down octane in the presence of oxygen to break that down, break down that molecule. That's going to release energy. And we're going to use that energy to move the vehicle. And of course, some of it will be lost as heat. That's why engines get hot, right? And then here in our bodies and our cells, this is what we're going to learn at the end of this chapter. This is the really important thing right here. We break down glucose in the presence of oxygen. When we break that down, it releases some energy that we use to make ATP. And of course, as always, we lose some of heat energy. And look, the byproducts are the same: carbon dioxide and water. And remember the thing I said from the last chapter. I said if you don't remember anything else from chapter 3? Chapter 3, it's this: cells need ATP for energy. That's how the story is going to go for this exam. That's the first thing you need to know. Cells need ATP for energy. And then in this chapter, I'm going to tell you how we make ATP. Well, of course, you can see it from here. We make ATP by breaking down glucose. And then the next chapter, we'll figure out how we make glucose. So it's all about that ATP. That's the end product. Anyway, any questions about this little slide? It's just a visualization of what we're saying. All right, that brings us to the main purpose of this this chapter, which is chemical respiration. Excuse me, cellular respiration. And I'm almost definitely not going to ask you the definition of it. You will need to know the 3 different phases, and I'm going to teach that later. There's 3 different stages of cellular respiration. You need to know what they are. You need to know what order they go in, and you need to know what happens in each one of them. So I might say this stage uses oxygen. This stage produces water. This stage produces ATP, and you're going to need to know that. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. What you do need to know on this slide that probably won't come up again, like this bit of information, so write it down if you're a note taker. This right here. Of all the food you eat, only about 34% of that energy is converted to useful work. The rest is released as heat. And if I remember correctly, your new textbook didn't include that, but this is one of those few times when I wanted to include something that wasn't in the textbook. So make sure, again, if you're a note taker, take that down, because that will probably be a test question, and I don't think it's written in your textbook. And hopefully by now, I'm not really that big into specific numbers, but this is one of those few that I am. About 34%. So any questions about this slide? All right. So like I said earlier, when you're doing real chemistry, so to speak, when you're doing higher level chemistry, we have all these chemical reactions, equations, excuse me, where it's numerical and we're really accounting for everything, all the different types of energy, all the different types of, the different levels of entropy, all that stuff. So here we go. We're going to talk about it very quickly, but this is all information that I'm not going to test you on. To me, this is higher level stuff, but it is out of your textbook, so we will talk about it very quickly. Free energy, and if you were to write this down in a chemical equation, we abbreviate that as a uppercase G, quantifies the energy available for doing work after accounting for losses. So basically, it's just the energy that's left. After a chemical reaction, it's the energy that's left. There's two different types of chemical reactions, and I told you this at the beginning when you first saw these words. You probably don't need to know anything about them, but just in case. Exergonic reactions is when energy is released. Endergonic reactions is when energy is needed for that reaction to happen. As far as I'm concerned, that would be all you need to know about this. Exergonic, energy is released. Endergonic, energy is absorbed. And it's in the name, right? Exergonic, getting that energy out there. Endergonic, bringing energy in. So really quickly, I'll read and say what the textbook says, even though you don't need to know this. But when I say energy is released, that means the change in the free energy, that's what delta G means, the change in free energy is negative. So when you look at the chemical equation, or look at these equations of a chemical reaction, if the delta G, if the change in G is negative, that means energy was released. You don't need to know that. Another way of looking at it is that means the products have less free energy than reactants. So basically, all those chemical reactions we were talking about earlier, those were exergonic reactions, right? I said breaking glucose down in the presence of oxygen releases energy and gives us carbon dioxide and water. So that would be an exergonic reaction, because like I said, when we break that energy, glucose down, it released energy. And the opposite would be true of endergonic. Again, delta G is positive, takes energy to do this reaction. The products have more free energy than the reactants. It's not spontaneous. So again, the most important thing to understand here is this idea, if anything, is that exergonic releases energy, endergonic needs energy. Now, regardless of which one we're talking about, and again, because those concepts are not very important for this course, but this last bullet point. Whether we're talking about an endergonic reaction or an exergonic, we still need an input of energy, and that input is called activation energy. Make sure you know that. Activation energy is the energy required to start the chemical reaction. Even these exergonic reactions where energy is released, we still got to get it started. Which makes sense, right? Because if you didn't require something to get it started, then it would just constantly be happening, and you don't need energy constantly being released. You don't need constantly being burning fuel, so to speak. Yes, and this is a very important concept that we're about to talk about even more. This stuff, we're mostly going to leave it behind us, but activation energy, that's really important. Can't have a discussion about activation and about enzymes without talking about activation energy. So, are there any questions so far before we talk a little bit more about the activation energy? All right, so again, activation energy is the energy invested to start a reaction. And you can see, sorry, I'll come back to this. I wrote it slightly different here. All reactions require initial energy input. So you could call activation energy the initial energy input. You could call it the energy invested to start a reaction. However, it's not one of those things where I'm going to ask you to define it verbatim. You just need to understand it. More importantly, and I'm going to come to this again and you'll see it in writing, but more importantly, the most important question you'll get about activation energy is, they'll say something like, how do enzymes work? And I'm about to teach you this, but I'll go ahead and give you the preview, the spoiler here. Enzymes work by lowering activation energy, so that's why this is so important. But let's talk about activation energy. Again, it's the energy invested to start a reaction. I go back to this metaphor here. There was a lot of energy put into that crossbow when you pulled the string back and cocked it. And like I said, it's just sitting there, right? The string's back, it's ready to go, it's ready for you to pull that trigger. There's a lot of potential energy ready to go when you pull the trigger. And in a lot of cases, it's deadly, right? It's a lot of energy. But the things that's not going to shoot itself, that would be dangerous. That's why we have a trigger. right? The trigger just doesn't shoot itself. It requires you to put some energy in. Now, it'd be a lot easier for you to kill somebody if you pulled that trigger and released a lot of energy that way than if you were to take that same force that your trigger finger has and, I don't know, try to choke somebody with your trigger finger, right? Because even though there's a lot of energy released, we only needed a little bit of, we needed less energy to start it. That's basically the same as chemical reactions. Even if it's an exergonic reaction that's releasing a lot of energy, we still need a little bit of an input of energy. Any questions about that concept? All right, here's a picture, I think from your old textbook. This kind of goes, but it goes with what we're saying, right? So some of the stuff that I told you didn't necessarily need to remember. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at exergonic reactions. The reason I can tell, because I told you this and said you didn't even remember, but the reactants have more energy than the products, right? So the reactants started off as high energy, but then through this chemical reaction of taking this one molecule and breaking it down into two, we released energy, right? But nonetheless, we still had a hill to get over. Basically, we had this hump, right? And that is the activation energy. So literally, just imagine you're trying to break that thing, and the only way to break it is knock it off this hill so it hits the ground and breaks, right? But in this case, you still have to have some energy. You've got to get over that hump before it can fall down and break. And this is what an enzyme does. An enzyme lowers that activation energy. In this case, yeah, there's still some activation energy needed. You still have to get it over that little hill, but it's a lot smaller. You knock it over, it falls down, it breaks, it releases energy. Your products have less energy than your reactants. Again, that can be complicated if you dig too deep into it or concentrate too hard on it. But the important concept here is that chemical reactions require an input of energy. That energy is called activation energy. And the whole purpose of an enzyme is to lower the amount of energy needed to start a reaction. And I think this is in writing later, but I'll go ahead and say it now and maybe say it again later. Almost every chemical reaction in your body wouldn't happen without the enzymes. There's just not enough energy in your body to make these chemical reactions happen. And that's not trivial because you are basically a bunch of chemical reactions happening. Without those chemical reactions, you're dead. You don't exist. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this video. It's the same thing, except it's a little bit more in detail. And they use these terms like delta G, right? Delta G is positive, delta G is negative. You can watch it if you want. All right. Some other things you need to understand about enzymes. They are very selective. I will say that. You need to know that. There will be a lot of questions about enzymes. Enzymes are very selective. So we're going to talk about a lot of chemical reactions in this chapter, next two chapters. Actually, a lot. In the next few chapters, we're going to talk about a lot of different chemical reactions. And none of them would happen without their very specific enzyme. So whenever I talk about a chemical reaction, you can almost guarantee that one specific enzyme does that chemical reaction and nothing else. Here's some other terms you need to understand, not because I'm going to ask you what they are, I probably won't, but I'm going to use them. And I will also use these terms in a question, but the questions won't be about them. So anyway, let's talk about these terms. Enzymes recognize what's called a substrate. You need to know what a substrate is. That is the reactant molecule. So substrate enzymes work on substrates. They work on the reactant molecules. Where on the enzyme does this happen? It happens on the active site. You can see a picture of one right here. This is just a generalized example of any old enzyme. Of course, they're all very specific. They're all very different. That's just a generalized version of one. But yeah, the active site is where the enzyme meets the substrate. And you can see here that the substrate generally fits the active site. Because like I said in chapter 3, maybe it was chapter 2, I said one of the most important things about a protein that you needed to know this was its shape, right? And here we go. Now it's finally important. Like, what does it matter what the shape is? And this is why. Because the substrates do physically fit in to the active site like a puzzle piece or a key, right? It's all about the shape. Also, it's a little bit about the chemistry. I won't talk about this too much, but yeah, it's not just the shape, it's the chemistry. For example, the shape, this is easy to see, right? We have something circular and something triangular. So something circular, something triangular. Obviously, the shape fits on here. But what they don't show is we could assume maybe this has a positive charge on this end of the molecule, and this has a negative charge, right? The chemistry would fit there. Does that make sense? Positive and negative go together. Or if this was hydrophobic and this was also hydrophobic, right? That would fit together. Or if this was hydrophilic and this was hydrophilic, right? So not only does it fit with the shape, but yes, the chemistry also fits. Anyway, another term you need to understand, this one's slightly less important, but we'll talk about it anyway. Something called induced fit. So basically, when the substrate attaches, when the substrate attaches to the enzyme at the active site, then the enzyme changes its shape a little bit, and that's something called an induced fit. And as far as I'm concerned, I think the best way to think of it is a hug. Like you all know how to hug, right? The hug ends up like this with your arms around and you're squeezing. But it doesn't start like that, right? You start like this. Because you can't start a hug like this and you'll just be bumping elbows, right? So you start like this, you come in, you wrap your arms around the other person, and you squeeze. That's a hug. That's sort of like the induced fit. The substrate comes to the active site, it fits mostly, but then the induced fit happens. And this picture doesn't actually show it, but then that enzyme kind of changes its shape and basically like squeezes around it, so to speak. So any questions about what substrate, active site, or induced fit are? Very important words that I'm going to be using a lot. All right. After the product is released in this chemical reaction, an enzyme accepts another substrate molecule. In other words, and this is the important part for the exam, enzymes are not used up in a reaction. So for the exam, I will give you a chemical reaction that you have presumably never seen, where it's like this plus this, arrow gives you this plus this. And I'm going to give you that equation that, again, in theory, you've never seen, and I might just make one up. And I'll say which one of these is the enzyme. So here's your first hint, this bullet point right here. It's not used up in the reaction. So anytime you see something on the left-hand side of the equation and the right-hand side of the equation, you pretty much, at least in this course, assume that is an enzyme because it wasn't used up. It's not necessarily a product or a reactant. Speaking of which, and in this course, that's how you'll see it. But in some other sources, you won't even see it listed in the chemical reaction. Actually, now that I think about it, we don't always do it in the chemical reaction either. Sometimes it's just not shown up in the chemical reaction. But again, for the exam, I will give you a reaction and say, this plus this, arrow, this gives you this plus this. I'll say which one is the enzyme, and if it's on both sides, it's an enzyme. As you should know, because, again, enzymes are proteins, and we've already talked about proteins. So here's a refresher of some things we've told you, or things I've told you. Enzymes, aka a type of proteins, are sensitive to the environment, right? Enzymes are sensitive to the environment, just like any other protein. Generally speaking, the warmer the temperature is, the faster a reaction happens. You should know that. That'll be important on the next lab. As temperature, generally speaking, as temperatures increase, chemical reactions happen faster, which makes sense because remember, temperature is just the movement of molecules, right? So the faster they're moving, you'd imagine the faster the chemical reactions are happening. Actually, that's a good place to stop. So the last word for attendance will be hot. And that's it. We'll come back and we'll finish talking about these enzymes on Monday. I'll be in office hours until 10, and I have to cut it short. After that, I'll be in the room next to us because I have a meeting that if you need me, come knock on the door and I'll leave the meeting and come talk to you. Be more entertaining than the meeting I'm going to be in. If you came in late, don't forget to email me to tell me you came in late.